Stephen Kennett, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Rath. Do you see the Malthouse compromise as a credible alternative solution?
Yes.
So I was in Brussels with the Brexit Select Committee on Monday, and we met with both Mr. Selmayr and Mr. Verhofstadt. And they made it absolutely crystal clear that the negotiations on the withdrawal agreement finished on the 25th of November. And it's a done deal, it's closed, it's not going to be reopened. They see it as a Pandora's box, which as soon as they reopen it for one issue will lead to a whole range of other issues being raised by other member states. So do you get, in light of what they've said, do you still see the Malthouse compromise as a credible proposal?
Well, I think it's a credible proposal in the sense that it provides answers to the problems that we've got. That doesn't mean it will be accepted on the EU side. You'll forgive me if I don't take at face value your record of what has been passed to you by our EU interlocutors, because my previous experience was that you put to me that Michel Barnier had said that the Chequers proposals were dead in the water, and it subsequently became evident that he hadn't said that.
Well, we can certainly have a discussion about that. I mean, I paraphrased what he said in the meeting, which
it's very clear from him
confirmed.
And the transcript that you put it to him that the proposals were dead in the water, and he said that that was not correct. And in fact, he went on to say some rather positive things about it. All I'm just saying is, forgive me if I treat rather lightly your first-hand record back to me of what EU interlocutors have said to you since my previous experience before you in committee.
Sure, I understand what you're saying, but in fact, my interpretation of what happened in that meeting with Mr. Barnier was entirely correct, because the proposals that were on the table
Mr. Kinnock, it was roundly rubbish, and you were actually engaged in political posturing. But I'm very happy to take any further questions you've got.
Well, thanks very much, and I'm certainly happy to take a lecture from you on political posturing. On the comments that Mr. Selmayr and Mr. Verhofstadt gave us, which are both on and off the record, I mean, it couldn't be clearer. If we just to get into this concept of what is a credible proposal and what isn't, how can it be that the Malthouse proposal is credible if it's not considered to be credible by the European Union?
Well, with the greatest, again, respect, the negotiations will be conducted not through select committees, whether this one or the Brexit Select Committee, but between principals. And at every stage of the negotiations, we've had some of the, shall I call it, more intransigent figures in Brussels give fairly tough lines. But that's part and parcel of negotiation, as you well know. And the reality is, in my view, that the EU has a choice to make. Because one thing the House of Commons has done, I think quite rightly, is give a very clear message that we need some legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement, particularly in relation to the backstop. I think that the Malthouse proposals provide a sensible template for that. But without that, well, first of all, with such changes, and they're fairly contained, they're fairly focused, it's not rewriting of everything, I think this deal will pass in the House of Commons, and without it, it won't. And therefore, it's decision time for the EU in the same way as it's decision time for the United Kingdom.
But obviously, the focus of this inquiry is on about learning the lessons of what's happened over the last couple of years. Surely one of the lessons that we should learn is when the EU has said something, it has meant it. 100% of the way, the British government has said, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Or, well, they're just playing politics, or, well, they're just posturing, whatever phrase you may wish to choose. But in fact, that is precisely what has ended up happening. And all the way through, anyone who's just tried to sort of point out this is the reality of these negotiations has either been accused of talking the country down or being a naysayer. But in fact, the lesson to be learned from all of this is that when the EU says what it means what it says. Wouldn't you agree with that?
No, I think you've had a variety of tweets, off-the-cuff remarks. I think of the Salzburg conference, where there was off-the-cuff remarks made, and then a number of other senior figures across Europe coming back and saying, hold on, that is not correct and not helpful. I think it's the part and parcel of a negotiation that you get press conferences, tweets, comments relayed via select committees, in order to toughen up the position, and it doesn't accurately reflect the substantive negotiating position, not least because the EU is not one homogenous whole. Indeed, the Commission isn't. It has a whole variety of different views, and even more so when you spread across European capitals.
Can you give an example of a substantive example of where the EU has said something of importance, say, for example, around the backstop or whatever issue you may choose, which hasn't in the end ended up being precisely the position that the British government has had to accept?
Well, it was being bandied around that we'd pay 100 billion. In the financial settlement, it's now 39 billion, so there's one.
Okay, thanks very much. On the issue of the backstop, last week Sabine Véand said on the record that negotiators had looked at every border on this earth and every border the EU has with a third country, and there was simply no way that you can do away with checks and controls. Do you think that's just sort of empty rhetoric as well?
Well, I heard an interesting anecdote, and I'll have to protect the source of it, whereby the point was made to UK officials at a very senior level that given the porous nature of the border on the Mediterranean, given the finite length and nature of the challenges on the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, if the situation in the Mediterranean borders was tolerable, it was not beyond the wit of man and woman, with the goodwill of the Irish, British and governments and the Commission, to resolve this problem. So I'll respect the integrity of how I learned about that, but I think it rather addresses the concern that Sabine Véand had.
Thanks very much. On just one final question, on the assumption that some sort of deal passes between now and the 29th of March, it's clearly the case that we would have to pass the withdrawal agreement implementation bill in order to be able to leave the European Union. Do you think that it's possible or credible to do that without having to have an extension beyond the 29th of March?
I think it looks very challenging. Whether it's physically possible, it would depend how much you're willing to extend the sittings. I am, at least at this point, open-minded, or at least not opposed to at least the possibility of a modest extension by, let's say, a week or two, if we had an acceptable deal to the United Kingdom in order to put through the relevant legislation. I don't think that's going to be the deal breaker on our side.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.